Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks. So I'm Loren Rotner. I'm the Assistant Chief Academic Officer and Assistant Professor at UATX. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we're here to discuss the increasingly severe effects of racial preferences and diversity, equity, and inclusion within higher education. Before we turn to our panelists, I want to tell you clearly what we are talking about when we refer to racial preferences and so-called DEI in higher education. Broadly, diversity initiatives include the creation of departments for the study of historically underrepresented minorities, but they also include official statements made by administrators on alleged systemic racism, the modification of university mission statements to include diversity as a primary goal, accreditation requirements mandating diversity programs and goals, research initiatives focused on diversity, and an expansion of the administration on campus to carry out these diversity goals. But diversity also directly affects the teaching and learning, the pedagogy of the campus. It insists upon a proliferation of diversity commitments required of potential faculty, reviews of contributions to diversity by current faculty, diversity performance evaluations for administrative staff, diversity quotas for faculty and other administrative hires, increased funding and privileges for certain faculty and staff who meet diversity criteria, and movements away from testing and ranking. The growth of diversity of initiatives has been met by an inevitable political blowback. But today we wish to approach these questions not with passionate anger, but with reasoned judgment. Let's see. In fact, we designed this program in part so that we could come together and calmly and rationally address the issues at the heart of these diversity initiatives. Today, we stand at the precipice of a major decision at the Supreme Court on affirmative action. Texas, Florida, and other states have banned DEI offices at their public universities. There is a tremendous and still growing amount of controversy surrounding these issues. So we are fortunate today to be joined by two preeminent experts to help us understand this all. We're joined by Dorian Abbot, who is Associate Professor of Geophysics at the University of Chicago. Dorian is the co-author of a piece at Newsweek entitled, quote, "The Diversity Problem on Campus," which led to the cancellation of his pre-planned talk at MIT. We're also joined by Carlos Carvalho, Professor of Statistics and La Quinta Centennial Professor of Business at McCombs School of Business at UT Austin. Along with Dorian, Carlos is the co-author of a new alternative framework called Merit, Fairness, and Equality, or MFE for short, which strives for unbiased evaluation and selection processes in higher education. Dorian, Carlos, welcome back to UATX.
Thank you.
Thanks. So before we begin, I just wanted to start with a real agenda-setting question, just a really broad question. What is the central purpose of the university? Let's start maybe with Dorian.
The purpose of a university is the pursuit of truth, and the definition of a university is a community of scholars.
I'll just add to that very similarly, the pursuit of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge, and the preservation of knowledge. I think that the preservation is something that it's widely forgotten in our mission, and it's something that most of us at university never discover anything in our lives, never. We just move around, think about it, re-explore some edges. But that exploration is part of the preservation of that knowledge. The knowledge stays alive there. Very few of us make innovations that actually are breakthrough, that leads for society to move forward. But that exercise of preservation is very important. And those three things are in the service of the pursuit of truth, for sure.
So these DEI programs that I cited in my introduction, what are the goals of those programs, and in what ways do they challenge the goal of the university, in your opinion? Do they support it? Do they undermine it? Give us an account of that.
The main goal of DEI programs is a make-work program for graduates of gender studies undergraduate degrees.
He's supposed to be the good cop. Well, their goal is, I think, is very. It's not just the make work program. That's a consequence of what has been put in place. But I think their goal is to try to create a society in light of some objectives they have that the left in particular in the country has. That lots of people in the country believe that we should have a more, quote, equal society, equal in the sense of outcomes. And they're basically using these institutions of knowledge creation, dissemination, and as a vehicle to try to achieve that. Well, we're here, and it would be great to have more of this or that or the other, whether it's color, whether it's gender, whether it's religion, whatever it is, the flavor du jour of those groups. They're trying to somehow address some kind of equality claim associated with those groups that absolutely undermines the mission of the university. It's not what the university is here for. It's not what the university should be doing. But that's their goal. That's what they're trying to do, achieve some notion of equality that is very specific, a very specific notion of equality defined by, that is in agreement with a particular political movement in the country, which is another major problem here that Dorian is lucky enough to be a professor at the University of Chicago, where they have this thing called the Calvin Report, which is something that basically established that the institution shall not take on political positions. Individuals can have political positions, but the institution shall not take on political positions. And the creation of these DEI offices is actually an imposition of a political position from the institution. Whether Chicago is a little bit easier to fight against that in Chicago because they have at least some principles in place, but in other universities that don't have that explicitly spelled out, it becomes like the politicization of the university has been now institutionalized on this office of DEI.
So at the University of Chicago, we actually have a DEI bureaucracy of diversicrats, even though we have the Calvin Report, and it's not considered to be inconsistent.
That's right.
But the Calvin Report does...
And how do they justify that? Or
They don't.
They don't.
But the Calvin Report has limited on a number of instances the statements that the diversicrats make. But we have to report them to the provost, and then there's a long period where they try to decide if it's a violation, and after a year, they take the statement down. So basically, you can they can make the statements they want, and they stay up online for a long time. And then sometimes we get them taken down. It's a constant fight.
What would you guys say to critics who might claim that the banning of diversity offices, right, especially maybe even potentially in private organizations, let's just say that's possible, well, that's a political position as well, and that politicizes the university.
Yeah, no, so there's two types of institutions you have to be thinking about here: state schools, government-run schools, and private ones. Which, by the way, that's a bit of a misnomer, because every private school in the country, whether you're Harvard, Chicago, or I don't know, perhaps UATX in the future, I'm not sure about that yet, it's a heavily subsidized by the government institution. It's an institution that receives a lot of federal dollars, that receives a lot of tax breaks, and therefore has a shared responsibility with government, which is a bit of a problem in my view. But a state school run by the government, run by the state, it's politicized by definition, because the budget of that school is a budget that's defined by politicians. Well, politicians, whenever a particular institution starts getting too antagonistic to the politicians who fund them, it's expected that those politicians are going to do something, going to act and change things in a particular way. There's no surprise. Universities have not been very lefty. That's not a new thing. It's always been the case. It's gotten worse and worse and worse through the years in terms of the balance has becoming more and more and more left. But then there's like a new level of policies and ideas and sort of the creation of these DEI offices and so on that is inviting this blowback, right? But I think governments exerting control of the institutions they fund is a necessary condition of the democratic process. You vote, your representatives decide how to spend your money. That's it. That's not politicization. That's the way the world works.
And I'd like to correct a misconception that sometimes comes up related to your question. It's not exactly your question, but sometimes people will say, if the Calvin Report bans collective statements by the university, then it's an imposition on academic freedom. But the reason that that's incorrect is that academic freedom is an individual right. It's not a collective right.
And the Calvin Report bans collective statements by the university,
Exactly, and
right, not individual.
The whole point, well, not just the whole university, but department, any unit of the university. But the whole point of the Calvin Report is to protect the right of individual faculty to speak out and not feel that they might be somehow harmed by speaking out against the position that the university takes. And so the whole point is to promote this definition of the university as a community of scholars, of individual scholars, each pursuing the truth.
Are there any situations where affirmative action or the use of race-based criteria for admission, hiring, et cetera, might be acceptable in your view?
So in my view, affirmative action or race-based criteria would be acceptable if you showed in court that the institution had actively discriminated against a group, but it would have to be supervised by a judge and it would have to be for a limited time. So just as an example, it looks like Harvard and UNC have been discriminating against Asian students. So it would be acceptable to have affirmative action in favor of Asian students at those locations for a limited amount of time, maybe 5 years.
I would say, I would disagree with that. I would say no. I would say no circumstances, and you would have to, if Harvard is deemed to be violating the law, which if you look at the evidence again, is not violating the law necessarily because they were allowed to do so, right? The Supreme Court, through previous decisions, have allowed admissions to be carried on with race-based preferences. But if that now changes and the new law of the land says, no, you're not allowed to do that, well, I prefer that we overlook a system that is neutral, as opposed to try to do any kind of reverse discrimination in any direction, right? So it's important to separate two things here. When Loren asked the question of affirmative action in hiring or admissions, in hiring, it's never been legal. It is absolutely a violation of federal law to hire using race as preference. You need to be blind not to see what's happening right now in all sorts of institutions where race is being used as a criteria for hiring. It's everywhere, and it's overt. I just flew here on American Airlines, and they say openly that they're doing everything they can to hire black pilots. Or they don't use those words, but that's what they're going for, right? They're trying as hard as they can, which is an illegal practice. That's been illegal, and there'll be lots. There'll be, we just saw recently something that happened on Starbucks losing a big case court that is basically showing that. And I hope that more of that's going to have to be adjudicated in courts. However, for admissions, in the 70s, I think, when was it the first?
Hockey, 1978.
Yeah, so late 70s. There was an unfortunate, in my view, court decision that says, well, no, for admissions in universities, it's okay. It's okay because there's a objective that can be accomplished by having a diverse group of people in a room, diverse defined by race, right? In a room for educational purposes. If there is an educational purposes, then that thing is allowed. And that's what's being now adjudicated against in the court, whether or not that is actually compatible with other provisions that we have in our Constitution, right?
And that's also why we have this word diversity. Nobody would be talking about diversity because the real goal is racial balancing.
Right.
They just use it because that's all they're allowed to say based on the Supreme Court.
That's right, because there's this weird, lawyers are not good with numbers. They're actually particularly bad with numbers. I'm married to a lawyer, so I can say this out loud, I suppose. Judges are particularly bad with numbers. And I think when they come up with this notion that, you cannot have quotas, but you can use diversity as a goal, they're not understanding that you're in a zero-sum game in admissions, right? You take more of this, you take less of that. So what you have, if you look at the data on Ivy Leagues on Asians, for example, it has been at 20% across all Ivy Leagues for, 20 years. So if that's not a quota, what is it? It is a quota. They have a quota, they have a target, and they fulfill the target. No more than 20% Asians. They explicitly say that. So that's not how they frame it, that's not how they try to portray, but that's what's happening. There's no way around it. Every time you allow for a particular race preference to take place, you are discriminating against somebody else. It's not possible to do otherwise. It's a zero-sum, it's a closed system, it's a zero-sum game. So anybody that knows a little bit about numbers knows that. And then the question is, why do we let this take place for so long, right? Moreover, you have a huge problem of defining diversity and race and so on, right? So here I'm from Brazil originally. If you do a 23andMe on me, it's going to be a mess, right? You're going to get, Brazil is like a notoriously integrated country in terms of race. I have Chinese great-grandparents, I have black great-grandparents, I have indigenous Brazilians, great-grandparents, and so on. Europeans, and so on. So what am I? How do I count in that particular box that you might want to create? How do you slice this up in a way that makes any sense? And it doesn't. It doesn't. It's always going to be arbitrary and capricious. And again, I think that's one a huge corrupting influence that we have in our universities these days.
So let's talk a little bit more about the practical effects of these programs, both in your experience anecdotally, but then also in terms of the data. You've cited some data already, but you've been on hiring committees, you've admitted graduate students, Dorian. Tell us some more about what is it like behind closed doors?
So affirmative action, which is also just racial preference, I think probably the biggest practical effects that it's had on higher education is leading to grade inflation, because there's immediate pressure put on the faculty not to grade certain races lower, and so that leads to grade inflation. And then the other major effect is that it's led to fewer black doctors, scientists, and engineers. And the reason is what's called the mismatch effect. And so if people would have gone to a school that they were matched at, and instead they go to a school that they're not matched well at, they're much more likely to leave challenging STEM fields and end up in the studies fields. And so that's probably the biggest effect of race preferences. The biggest effect of DEI programs is cancel culture, this pervasive culture of fear about speaking out about important issues on campus, because the DEI diversicrats are going around telling people that if you disagree with ABC, then you're some sort of phobe, and the students are told that they're being microaggressed against and they have the right to shut down that person's speech so that they're not platformed.
Yeah, so take a utilitarian view on this, right? So one might ask the question, okay, well, you might not like ethically this idea of having race-based preference for admissions. You might not like that legally, but let's think about from a utilitarian point of view. Does it work? And the answer is absolutely not. It does not work. It has not closed the gap whatsoever between different racial groups, in particular the one racial group that is the main target of race preference. It has not worked at all. All that you have achieved is to have more of certain groups getting college degrees in certain institutions. I don't think in an aggregate it has changed that, but in some institutions of more prestige, right? But it has not done anything. And partly is because of the mismatch theory, right? So if you go into a place where you're not really ready for it, you're not achieving the same as others, there's only two ways this can go. Either you're going to have to lower down the standards of that place, which has happened. We all have been suffering from that. There's various causes for this, not only affirmative action, but the affirmative action has contributed tremendously to the degrading of higher ed standards. And second, you lower the standards, or you are going to have to kick out some folks that are not achieving the standards that you put in front of them, and you see that happening right now. The completion rate at Harvard or other elite schools is something like 98%. So you get in, you get out. There's no question. Either they're magical in admissions, or it's not hard enough, right? It should be harder. It should not be a 98% completion. I mean, that's the disservice we have for society, having a 98% completion in our elite institution. It should be much harder than that. That's where we are. I would also add that in the DEI practices for hiring, what's happening is that you have academics is something that used to be very meritocratic, very much about your ideas. You're only as good as your last paper. You're only as good as your last idea. Nothing else should matter in the pursuit of knowledge. Well, once you start layering in other considerations, all of a sudden you now get scholars that are just not as good. They're not as ambitious. Because they're not trying. By the way, it's already really hard to identify good scholars, especially early in their careers. You need to take on a lot of bets. We have a system of tenure that will say, okay, here's a bet. You have 5-6 years. Show me what you got. Then you get kicked out if you don't show any good progress, any good creation, and so on. But again, if you use criteria that are gender or race in the hiring process, guess what happens 5 years later? Are you going to kick them out? The answer is no. It's already happening big time, not kicking them out. So then there's a perpetuation of this that has a long-term impact in society. Our institutions are going to be losing their sort of ability to create, preserve, and pass on knowledge to the future.
It's a vicious cycle because A's hire A's and B's hire C's. And so all of a sudden you get a faculty who's not even competent enough to choose who should be on the faculty. Right. The other problem is that the people who are hired based on affirmative action, they tend to overlap with ideologues, and they also tend to drift in that direction, especially if they're not seeing the success that they would like to see in their scholarship. And so the ideologues end up pushing this stuff even further.
Right.
Well, tell us a little bit more about this framework you guys have proposed, the MFE framework.
I came late to the game here, so Dorian is the one that started.
Well, first it was Ivan Marinovich and I, and I wanted to come up with Yvonne wanted to write something about how much he didn't like DEI, and we decided to write an article. And I said, well, we got to make a positive statement too. We can't just say how bad something is. And so I said, let's give them a three-letter acronym so that they can have an office with that thing. Like if we can't get rid of all the diversicrats, let's make them meritocrats. So at least they're not doing something negative against the university, but they can still keep their sinecures and kind of twiddle their thumbs. And so that was the basic idea. And the choice was merit. It's going to be, everything is going to be based around merit. Fairness, because no one's going to get discriminated against. And equality, which is the traditional sense of equality and meant to contrast with the Kamala Harris equity sort of a thing. And so that was our idea. And then basically it's just a repackaging of standard, you could call them classical liberal or traditional values associated with the academy, where you don't discriminate against anyone on the basis of their skin color or religion or political beliefs. You use standard metrics, the best metrics you can find to evaluate people's academic success and promise. So at low levels, that tends to be, at low levels like selecting undergraduate students, that tends to be SATs and high school grades. At higher levels, you have to get a little bit more qualitative to hire faculty because it involves a certain amount of judgment about the importance of their scholarship. But you can incorporate other quantitative measures related to citations and things like that. But you would never take into account things like, where the person was from or what color their skin is or any irrelevant personal detail like that, what their sexual preferences are, things like that.
Yeah, I'll add to that too that those ideals are not ideals that have been. So people point to the legacy of universities being okay. You haven't behaved all meritocratic in the past before affirmative action. That's true. Universities have been clubs for some, legacy admissions, or say they had a bad history of discriminating against Jews, for example, and against blacks, and against other groups as well. So there was a time where things were bad, things were not equal, things were not meritocratic. We still have, I think, a lot of usage of admissions and hiring, particularly admissions, that takes into account things that should not be taken into account, in my view, when it comes to college admissions. I think we talk about legacy being one of them.
In
right?
that article, we also said we
exactly.
should get rid of legacy and athletic.
So there's definitely a need. There was a need for universities to become better at not necessarily use attributes in ways that were bad in the past, but. What is the quote from the Justice Roberts? So the only way to stop discrimination is to stop discrimination. You cannot just switch it around a sign and think that, oh no, now discriminating against this group is okay, and to make for something out. But the data is very informative on this. There's a lot of data now on all sorts of different dimensions in which you can see that by the 1990s, there's very little evidence in the country, very little evidence in scientific communities in particular, that there was any discrimination based on gender, based on race, in hiring, in advancement of scholarship, and grant-giving things. There's a few different papers that have been written recently showing that. So there was, back in the day, there was more. That sort of converged. So in the 50s and 60s, there were issues in place. Those issues kind of cleared themselves out of the system by the late 1990s. And then now they open up again, but in the reverse direction that you might think about. So now it's much easier, for example, to get tenure as a woman relative to a man, has a much higher shot. Much easier to get tenure as a member of certain racial groups and that was reversed before, back in the 60s and 70s perhaps, right? But that actually had gone away. So we went through a period of time where things were sort of at a sweet spot in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. And then things went off in the wrong directions again. So trying to think about policies that bring us back to that neutrality is what I think we should be.
I want to add something to what Carlos said. So it's not just that there was no evidence of discrimination around, let's say, from 1990 to 2005. There's strong evidence that there wasn't discrimination in those papers. There's strong evidence that there was no bias in these.
Exactly. That's right.
And then the other thing is the earlier periods where there was slight evidence of discrimination against certain groups, it was very marginal.
But now is incredibly strong.
Now it's incredibly strong. And so it was actually basically within the error bars in the 1960s in these groups that maybe there was a slight favoritism for evil white males. But around 2020, there's a very strong, well outside the error bars, negative coefficient.
Right.
So let's move on to the Supreme Court. Let's just say they overturn affirmative action. How do you think the universities will respond practically?
So the diversicrats are not going to give up their game, not at all. So you see this in Berkeley, in the California system, where they had a law saying you guys, you can't do this racial balancing and racial quotas. And it worked for a little bit, and actually it was hugely successful. Not only was it a fairer system, but because of this mismatch effect, as a result of that, there were much more graduates, Black and Hispanic graduates in STEM fields. But then they found a way around this, and what they did was they went by zip code and by high school. They did admissions with favoritism by zip code in high school. And I think it's almost certain that the universities are going to do that. And probably what they're going to do is just continue with their explicit racial discrimination and just challenge people to sue them.
I agree that nothing's going to change until more lawsuits are in place. The notion that there's ways to get around, even you can try to quantify, right, ex-ante policies that will. Now, I actually don't have a major problem if they say that ex-ante and say we're going to have zip code quotas. So everybody knows that. When you're applying to University of California, Berkeley, for example, they know there's only 3 people from this zip code. Only 3 people from that zip code. If they say that a priori, that's fine, because I can now game it. I can think about maybe I should move to this place and try to be the good student from that place, right? And so on. And if it's objective based on that, everybody knows the rules, that's fine. That's not based on anybody's skin color or anything that's an immutable characteristic. You can move. But it's not going to be like that, right? It's going to be after the fact. They're going to look at, well, we don't have enough zip code balance. So it's not an ex-ante rule, but an ex-post rule. And when you do that, you're just using zip code as a proxy for race. And that's already taking place, and there's going to be more. That you're going to see a lot more. That socioeconomics is the other one. Oh, we need a more balanced socioeconomics distribution in our university. Tell me how that's important for the creation and pursuit of knowledge. If you want to be the best chemist in the world, let's pick the people who have the best brains to be the best chemists, and that's how society and humanity moves forward. Not by thinking about how your socioeconomic status might help you be a chemist or not, right? So I think that you're going to see a lot of shenanigans going on, illegal practices going on, just the same way that they all. Don't confuse the fact that something is already very illegal, which is hiring practices based on race and gender, very illegal, and it takes place. So tell me, so now the Supreme Court says something, those judges cannot enforce the law. They can say this is the law of the land. They cannot enforce it, right? And until people start acting on it, I have zero hopes that the state of California is going to clamp down on the University of California system. Perhaps in Texas we might do something, be a little bit more careful and so on, but not in California. Harvard, there'll be maybe more lawsuits and lawsuits and lawsuits. They can afford those lawsuits, and it's not going to change very rapidly. It's going to be less overt. That's what I expect to happen.
Yeah, so just to give you an example of the fact that there's already discrimination going on that's illegal in hiring, in 2017, I was on the hiring committee for my department, and I didn't know anything about this stuff at the time. And the dean passed us, a message verbally through a number of sources that he would not consider a white or Asian male in this hire, even though we posted, no discrimination on the basis of blah, blah, blah. And that was the context that the hire went down in. And so that's the sort of thing that happens. I had an email from someone saying that this is what he heard from the dean, but that's the closest we had to a direction. And so they're pretty good about knowing how to sort of not put anything in writing about this.
Well, it's funny because they're pretty good, but they also they're so convinced they're doing God's work here that they don't care sometimes, and they put in writing. Yeah, there's a lawsuit in place right now against the University of Texas A&M University in College Station here in Texas, where the president has an email sent to deans stating that this money can only be used to hire such and such. So it's not like a completely legal act, right? That's not something that in the state of Texas with public money. So if that was happening in things that are already illegal, do I have a lot of hopes that this is whatever, holistic or whatever words they're going to use for it, they're going to go away? I doubt it. I doubt that you're going to have an immediate impact. Though the necessity of lawsuits is going to be like this, until there's liability and people start suffering consequences of breaking the law, this is not going to go away.
So my only objection to that is that these actors all believe they're doing God's work. And
yes.
So the reason I say that is I think because of some of these issues we've discussed, if your goal was really to promote underrepresented groups in the academy, I don't think you would be following these policies. And one of the things we proposed in the MFE article was increased investment in education of disadvantaged groups or poor groups or whatever, which is the sort of thing that would actually potentially help identify outstanding prospects from different backgrounds. But that's not something that's being pursued. And I think this sort of racist charge or phobe charge is just used as a battering ram to protect these sinecures that these people have carved out for themselves. It shouldn't be read as a good faith effort to do God's work.
So what about the DEI bans in Texas and Florida on campus? What's going to happen to these offices?
So it's a good start. It's a good start. They didn't defund them. They said that you shall not have this, which is, a little hard for a university. So we have all these people working there in these offices, and there's offices that are all over the place now at a university, as big as the University of Texas, for example. Okay, you shall not have the office of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Politicians like the slogan of, we're fighting DEI, we're fighting whatever the current word is. Well, they changed the name of that office. Okay, now I have the office of belonging, the office of community engagement. Those are the names that are coming up already in this space. And the same people working there with the same objectives, right? So, I mean, you're slowing them down a bit with these laws. There were some ideas floated in the Texas legislature this past cycle. There were more aggressive ideas. I might have, some people involved in this were trying to be very aggressive in the types of things you put in place, mechanisms put in place in order to stop their work. So one mechanism that was floated was the mechanism of anybody can sue, the right of private action. I don't know if you follow this in Texas, but the way we ban abortion in Texas, the state of Texas banned abortion really before Dobbs actually was overturned by the Supreme Court, was that a basically law that allowed any individual in the state to have standing to sue anybody providing an abortion. So that was one of and this creates like the de facto, nobody will do anything because everybody has standing to sue. So nobody would perform an abortion. So you might disagree strongly with that particular tactic in that particular political fight, but that was a very effective way to stop something. Before Roe was overturned, there was a de facto ban on that practice in Texas. So if they had the same gusto to fight DEI as they had to fight abortion, they could have done the same thing. Any individual, let's say at the university, has the right to sue whenever something like that takes place, whenever you see a violation of civil rights law, essentially, right? But that was removed from the law. So nobody has standing to sue. There's no liability that the individuals performing those illegal acts, actually, they have immunity, essentially, by working inside of the university. So I think that there will be basically the need for a lot of whistleblowers to keep pointing out, listen, they keep doing it. And then, in 2 years' time, perhaps legislators will crank it down a little further. That's also true in Florida. The law is not very strong in terms of its teeth.
I just want to talk about belonging for a second. All of the DEI letters are basically being used in the antonym of what they actually mean, if you look in a dictionary. But belonging is a particularly cynical one for institutions that only accept, usually under 5% of their applicants to go around talking about how they're promoting belonging. But anyways, just to give you a sense of the level of intellectual discourse around these issues, when our new president at University of Chicago, Olivia Satos, came, I was at a physical science division-wide faculty meeting, and the person who introduced him said, well, our new president, he's from Berkeley. He was the provost at Berkeley, and he knows a lot about DEI stuff. In fact, he uses a new word that he's added on, belonging, to applause, like this was some great innovation that now it's DEI and belonging.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I want to throw it open to questions from the audience, yeah, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of great questions. So let's get the microphones out. Let's start maybe over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Konstantin. I'm from Austria. And I went actually to a boarding school in the US for 1 year. And that's why I was wondering how you think about equality of opportunity, because like the kids I met there, they had like much more resources than anywhere else. So they had like SAT training. The teachers would tell them what looks good on a college application. It was just much easier for them to get into a good school, and they were predominantly white. So how do you think about this? Should they compete against people from underprivileged backgrounds with all their support? I mean, it's not necessarily better candidates just to get
so I think this is a big driver of DEI. I've thought about why is DEI so popular, and I think what it is the people in that. So the SAT training doesn't actually change the SAT very much because it's highly correlated with IQ, and so there's not a huge effect. That's not what the SAT training people who try to sell it to you want you to believe. And so if you're from a wealthy family, why do you want Harvard to do DEI? Well, and to drop the SAT. Well, then it's easier to get, junior who's not too bright in. Whereas if it's just based on a rigorous test that everyone has to take, then it's harder to get your not too bright offspring in.
So I'll add to that is the fact that, yeah, it's unfortunate that, actually, that's not unfortunate. Let me take that back. It's not unfortunate that we live in a world where people have different means and different resources and different opportunities. That's the reality of the world, right? That's always been the case and always going to be the case. That there's what was the question? Peter just left the room. Said, can something be true and no? Can something be moral and untrue? What was I can't remember.
Moral and false. Yeah.
Moral and false, right? I think that that humans are created equal. That's a falsehood. They're not created equal. Some of us are better than others. Some of us are faster than others. Some of us are smarter than others. Some of us are whatever, right? So, and that obviously has a result in the outcomes of society. And not everybody has the same opportunity. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Now, yes, there's a role of governments trying to come in and try to help out, and there's transfers and things that we try to do to elevate some folks and so on, right? So there's lots of positive things that we do. But that solution is not at the very end of the academic achievement to get to the very end and now decide who's going to get to Harvard and try to solve the problem there. That's a terrible use of resources, right? You cannot solve it. It's over. The problem is over there. There's nothing you can do at 17 to close that gap, if that's something that comes in and from IQ and all sorts of other things. So I think that effort should start much, much earlier. Anyways, there's lots of things we can discuss on that, right? But I think especially when you're trying to now populate the elite institutions of higher knowledge. And the brightest should go to the best place. And then the second brightest goes to the second brightest place. That's the way in which all of us in society will benefit at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so a related point is just that every institution has to act in accordance with its telos, with its ultimate purpose. And so if you have, a great engineering school that's accepting people because they're worried about this problem of inequality, that's accepting people who are not qualified and passing them, and then bridges start falling down, that's really bad for society. And so although this is an issue that you may want to deal with, the equality of opportunity in society, some people may want to deal with it more. It sounds like you do. Carlos wants to deal with it less. That's the appropriate instrument for dealing with that is certainly not the university. It must stay within its telos, which is the pursuit of truth and knowledge.
Let me add one more thing here that I'm particularly passionate about in this discussion, is that the notion of, people have different opportunities, and therefore maybe there's some role to play here. But well, why do we focus on just then the opportunities for folks in a particular geographical area or folks of a particular skin color? Like, I don't know, we don't have enough Indonesians in our schools. Indonesians don't have the same opportunities that white Americans have, right? There's a lot of bright Indonesians out there. Why don't we make a big, strong effort to get Indonesians into Harvard? We don't. So there's something inconsistent about that notion.
Oh, wow. We got so many questions. Okay, let's go here.
Hi, I'm Ian. I've had a question about, Dorian, you proposed that in your paper, I think I heard you say this, that we might allocate more educational dollars to underrepresented communities in order to solve the presupposed problem here of trying to represent people more equally in higher education. if I'm stating that correctly.
Yeah, I mean, well, so let me just say what we said exactly. We said if a university, so suppose the University of Chicago decides that this is an important issue to the way that they should try to deal with this situation would be programs like that. Yeah. And we said that they should be objective and empirically tested programs. So for example, you should do some charter schools funding and some school voucher funding and some increased funding to public schools, see what works, and then pursue that en masse.
Okay, so my question then is, how is that, from a moral perspective, any less discriminatory than doing that at the level of admissions, if you're allocating dollars again based on?
Okay, so let me my answer, because I have, again, zero tolerance for any use of race on any decision making. So my ethical standard is very clear on this. Under no circumstances, race is to be allowed to be used as an input. Therefore, in the allocation of dollars, societal dollars, or University of Chicago dollars to a certain program, if it's race-based, I think is illegal and immoral. Or immoral, right? Now, there's things that we do that does benefit disproportionately certain groups, but they are done in a neutral basis, right? So if we have vouchers, for example, a vouchers program is something that's going to benefit folks in poor neighborhoods that go to bad schools, because those parents now have the ability to take them to, let's say, a private school. That's going to have a benefit to some underserviced people right now, but that was not done in a race-based way. And that's a very different, I think, approach to the problem.
We didn't actually advocate race-based in there. It was just underprivileged or whatever. We didn't advocate specifically race-based.
So go back there.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm from Davidson College in North Carolina. I had a question about merit and race and income and things like that. So in the past, discrimination was more based on race, and people, we briefly talked about this, didn't have opportunities because of their race. I would argue more that today people don't have opportunities because of income, and you're proposing to let applicants in based on their merit. Suppose you had two people who have the same IQ, same SAT score, but one kid he's founded a nonprofit, he helps out at his clubs, he's president of 3 clubs, he's able to do these things, versus another student who's maybe had to work 40 hours a week at Target or something like that. How are you able to distinguish merit without looking at things like income and lack of opportunity?
So in my formulation, I think Carlos is going to agree with me here. You don't take into account all of the silly thing, like I was the captain of the ping pong team, and my best friend ate a peanut butter jelly sandwich, and I helped him make it the day before yesterday, and whatever else. It's just you have an algorithm that you have an objective function you're trying to predict, which would be something like graduation rate, academic GPA, ability to sustain themselves in a STEM field, or future income 10 years from now or whatever. And then you have input functions, which would be things like GPA and SAT. You would allow possible inputs like peanut butter jelly sandwich making, but it's very unlikely those would end up being robust predictors. And so this actually would be the huge benefit of the poorer people who don't know how to game the system, who just sent in their application, and it would be to the detriment of the rich people. And I think that's the ultimate cause of all this DEI stuff, is that the rich people want to do this so they can confuse the system and add a lot of noise, and then they can get Ding Dong Jr. in.
So that your point of somebody that worked 40 hours a week and achieve the same level, that's something that can be made objective. Because there is actually evidence that, if you are able to get these grades and work this much or whatever, those things actually are quantifiable and could be used in an algorithm to make a prediction that said that person has extra ability to, get things done. And therefore, with this kind of level of intelligence and the ability to get things done, that's a better candidate to be admitted, right? But everything else equal, so I've thought a lot about this in terms of there's this notion that, okay, everything is equal, but now there's a white and a black person here. Do you think it's okay now to choose based on race? And I still say no. If they're the same person,
flip a coin.
Flip a coin. Randomize. Randomization is a beautiful thing. And it's honest, and it's transparent, and everybody, I think, will be okay, fine. So you try as hard as possible to be objective. So.
And I've seen these discussions. So first of all, once you allow the possibility that, if they're equal, then it starts to slip. And it's like, what counts as equal starts to be, pretty unequal.
Right.
Basically, you're allowing a principle that for ethical grounds should not be allowed.
Go to this gentleman here.
Hey, my name is BTN Yuan, and I go to Stanford. And as you can tell from my name and the way I look, Chinese male, probably the most discriminated person in college application. And I still would support such affirmative actions, which is not based on race. But let me ask you a question, right? If there are factors that would obfuscate a person's true intelligence, a person's true excellence, do you think that we should, let's say, try to get rid of those factors as much as possible in a person's application?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the failures of our system right now is that by not focusing single-minded on merit and abilities, right? We stop even trying to identify ways, figure out the ways to identify that. We gave up on it. We're giving up on it now by saying, do away with the SAT. We're trying to obfuscate it even more because we're just saying, like, we don't want any objective measures. And that's going to make it very hard to distinguish A from B, right? So I think I agree 100% that measuring merit and excellence is not an easy thing, but there's better ways and worse ways to do it. And we should be working as a society, as universities, as best as we can to identify those things. As quantifiable as possible, because I don't believe anything. Somebody says, oh, no, I'm really great at judging from the essays. It's like, no.
Okay, but like,
right?
If one of those factors is the amount of money that your family has, should we at least try to discriminate against those families who have had kids, who have all these great things? We should discriminate against that at least a little bit, right? And give the...
So that's not discrimination. That's like saying that, well, if I control for in a regression, for your income, right? And your income controlling for all the other things based on, your intelligence, whatever, things that we can measure. Income is a negative coefficient. Sure, income is a negative coefficient. Therefore, higher income, lower probability of getting in.
What if you get the opposite sign?
If you get the opposite sign, well, I'm fine if you get the opposite sign and say, okay, if income predicts that you're going to be even better, so be it. Richer people are going to get to Harvard. I have absolutely no problem with that.
And what type of society would that be? Let's say if it's extremely polarized.
It's a society
rich,
that's
smart,
going to
dumb.
advance further because knowledge is going to be better served in that way.
So the point is that that's not how you try to solve such a problem. Suppose that you're worried about that problem, then you would do income redistribution.
That's right.
You wouldn't do it by messing around with the...
We're having a discussion early in the green room here, and I was saying that, well, maybe we should have a 100% death tax. That's it. There's no inheritance. You give it away to, we're going to redistribute that. So that's one way, that's a very extreme way to stop the problem, right?
I have to say that as a husband and father, I would not want 100% death tax
I'm not suggesting that's a good idea. I just said that hypothetically as a way to
that
deal
would
with
put
a
my
problem
wife
like
in a
that.
pretty bad position.
James Madison was also in favor of that. But maybe we'll go over here.
Yeah, you're just too right-centric.
Hi, I'm Maggie. I'm from Philadelphia. And I have kind of a fundamental devil's advocate question. So the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, I'm sure you know, he said that we have to choose. A university needs to decide what it's for, what its telos is, whether it's social justice or truth. And my question is, why is social justice U necessarily a bad university? If it doesn't need to build bridges, if it doesn't need to do certain things, maybe we say there isn't STEM at Social Justice University. Why is the telos of university truth?
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. But that's what they have right now. If you go to any institution of higher learning in America, 99% of them, they're going to say that they are an institution of pursuit of truth. They might be lying to us. They are lying to us. So all of them say the same thing. Now, I am absolutely okay with somebody saying, no, we're going to have a very different thing here. We're going to have an institution that is about different ways of learning. That's a popular term these days. We're an institution about, like, whatever. Fine. Find an institution about social justice, whatever way you want to define that term. That's okay, but don't think that this is a place that's going to be the place the next, where we're going to figure out fusion energy. We're not going to figure out fusion energy there.
So do you want your universities, which are the store of knowledge of humanity, the place where new knowledge is discovered, the place where knowledge is transmitted to the next generation, do you want them to be based around pursuing truth, or do you want them to be a good university or sort of a crappy NGO? I think that's the question, right? And so it's fine to have crappy NGOs out there, but I just think that's not what we want our universities to be doing.
And by the way, there's also, you can say, there exist universities that have a very strong religious mission associated with them. And that might actually be in conflict with the telos of the university, as Jonathan defines it in his essay. So I'm okay with that. Some universities say we are of this denomination, we believe the earth is 3,000 years old, and that's whatever it is, and that's it. Okay, they're open and honest about that. That's okay. I'm not suggesting, I'm a very libertarian person, and so do what is best for you. If you think, be honest about it. But I don't think that as a standard for all of our universities would be a good thing for society. It would not be a good thing for society, right?
I think this is a bit of a related question, but I'm Campbell. I'm headed to Hillsdale College in the fall. Do you think that specifically public universities have any kind of civic responsibility because of the way they get their funding that's in conflict or at least in tension with the goal of having a university that's completely focused on obtaining knowledge?
I think the opposite. Public universities in particular have the goal of increasing knowledge because that's why they're publicly being funded. That's why the legislatures vote them money.
Again, I would agree with the last sentence here, right? I think that they have a responsibility with the people who fund them. That's the ultimate owner of the public university is the people of that state. In America, we're talking about states. In Europe, most universities are federal. I think in the not federal, like they're country centric, right? And I think there's a democratic process for that. We know, and it's ugly. It's ugly as hell. And that's the responsibility lies on, is if the state of Utah decides that their universities have to be defining Mormon religion, I have no problem with that if that's done in the proper ways of government. I don't think it's a good idea, but that's I understand where that comes from. You cannot just separate the will of the people who funds a certain institution, right? So the hope is that you can establish a system that represents that state ideas as well as possible, but that's difficult to do. And in some ways, my preference would be for us not to have them, not to have at all public universities. I would much prefer states to be giving people, okay, here's some check, go study, go to higher ed, and go sample from these institutions that exist, because I think that there is a inherently corrupting influence of having the political process dictate what happens inside of a university.
My name is Grant, and I'm from Miami. We're talking about education primarily here, but the military is another arena where this is a hot topic, to say the least. And the line that you'll hear from 3- and 4-star generals is that diversity is our strength. That's kind of hard to argue with. I'm sure a similar argument is being made. You said in the past the Supreme Court case was based on, well, there's some sort of educational benefit to having racial diversity. So what's your opinion on that? In the military, I'd be interested to hear if you have thoughts, but also just in education, is there any reason to believe that diversity of race does actually have educational benefits?
So, first of all, I don't think it's hard to argue with a vapid statement like diversity is our strength. The first thing you would do is show us the exact evidence that proves that diversity is your strength. What studies have you done to show that units that have racially diverse or gender diverse, whatever, perform better than other units? And if they can, then that's fine. Then diversity is our strength. But the generals never show those studies, right? Which implies to me that they don't have them.
Rob Henderson is here, and he wrote something really, a nice piece on that. He might be teaching a class, I guess. He's right there. Maybe you can say it, right? You did a very careful study on or looked at the evidence with the military checks on what delivers on good tank commanders and so on and so forth. Right? So what is the...
I wrote a post on my Substack last year or something about military selection processes, and they essentially use an IQ test too, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. It correlates very highly with IQ, it correlates with the ACT, the SAT, and so they have cutoffs as well. To my knowledge, no one has yet called to abolish the ASVAB, although the day is young, who knows. But I don't know if this is necessarily related to diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and so on, but there have been many studies done on the benefits of selecting for intelligence in the military and physical fitness. One of the best, two of the best predictors of success in Army basic training is essentially an IQ test and someone's score on a basic physical fitness test. So maybe diversity is our strength, but they're still using very strict physical and mental aptitude requirements.
But let me add also to the military the fact that I think we talked about zip code diversity earlier, right? My understanding is that West Point has the admissions procedure for West Point is that they take one person from every congressional district, okay? Well, you can understand the objective of that for that particular university, right? It's a very special university. It's a university that's not here for the pursuit. If they say that they're here for the pursuit of truth, they're lying. That's not what they are, right? They're training our future military leaders, and that's a very important mission. And I understand that part of the mission involves some sort of like cohesive and unit of the country in the sense that, we're in this together. I need representation from the country as a whole in order to have leaders from, everywhere whenever we have a problem that needs to be addressed in a collective way through the military. So I understand their goals, and that makes a lot of sense, right? And again, it's about the objective. If that's your objective, then that particular choice is not a problematic choice. And by the way, it's ex ante as well, in the sense that they say up front, this is our rule. Right? If you think you have a better chance moving to this congressional district here, get into West Point, you can go ahead and do it. Right? It's not after the fact trying to come up with some sort of racial balancing.
And then just as a general point about this diversity as our strength issue, so in the second Merit, Fairness, and Equality paper that Carlos was a co-author on, we cite a big meta-analysis that studies all the available studies of this issue, and what it found was that racial diversity has a slightly negative impact on team outcomes, and diversity of sort of perspectives has a slightly positive impact. But both of these are not huge effects.
Hello, my name's Corwin. I was wondering if you think that if we disregard race, that there are some scenarios where instead of merit as being the best candidate or the best heuristic to pick candidates, it could be something like diversity. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine you're a college hiring for a new economics professor, and the best candidate happens to be a macroeconomics professor. But your department is already really strong in macroeconomics. Is there a case for you to look for a microeconomics professor, even though that would not be fair to the macroeconomics professor?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you've got to have a well-balanced department that presents all of the major subfields within your discipline. I don't think anyone is arguing.
I struggle with that question because I have yet to hear from an academic administrator how do they allocate resources to different departments, different groups in that particular regard, in the sense that, well, if I'm able to hire a lot of very good geophysicists and not very good chemists, then I don't know if I like the fact that I'm going to hire subpar chemists over here just because I need to have chemists. I maybe would rather have more, in your example, more macroeconomists because, yeah, double down on that. Make that be your thing. So the moment you create, again, quotas based on knowledge fields, right, you might end up hiring people that are not as good at that. But in a football team, for example, you have to have a quarterback and you have to have a line. You have to have those positions. And in university, sure, you have to cover certain areas of teaching, but on the research side, you could be very much concentrated on an area, right? So I tend to prefer to be almost as get the best athlete. And you don't have to have this balance inside necessarily. So I lean on the side of merit as much as possible there, to the limit of what's possible. That would be my preference. I do. I think that if for some reason my institution is such that attracts only people that want to be computer scientists and I'm going to get only the best computer scientists, so be it. And that might be a better, again, it's a sorting. I think that sorting matters. And maybe folks there want to be studying history, they're better served in another place. That's fine. I don't think we need to have this balance everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say is that it's often very hard to compare candidates for a faculty position across different subfields and definitely across fields. Right. So you're going to have a hard time figuring out who's got more merit as a faculty candidate, a chemist or a mathematician. Like, they're just such different fields. Right. But I definitely think that the balancing issue across fields is more important for faculty and much less important for students.
Right. I think we got time for maybe 2 more questions. Let's take this one here.
Hi, my name's Ava. I'm a rising junior at Villanova. And when I was applying to colleges, this was kind of on the forefront of everyone's mind, this movement towards DEI and inclusion for people. And I actually had an experience with an admissions officer who told my counselor kind of off the record that I had a great application, but they just didn't need any more white girls from New Jersey. So I guess my question for you guys is, on a more individual level, what advice would you give to people who seem to be suffering and are kind of discriminated against in this whole DEI movement?
Apply to UATX. Hopefully that's going to be a better version of it. It's hard, right? It's really hard. Just let me ask you the question. Raise your hand if you thought the process was very fair when you're applying to college. Okay. Right. So that's not. I think that if you ask the country, if people think it's a fair, transparent, honest process in place, most people think it's not, and because it's not. And whether it's not because of legacy, whether it's not because of racial preferences, whether it's not because it's opaque, the opacity of it, I think, is a huge, huge problem. So I think the level of trust there right now is really bad, and I don't know. It's hard to give answer what to do here, other than I would say that if a college is saying don't submit your SAT, F them. No, you take your SAT, show how smart you are, send whatever. Go to the colleges that want to see your SAT. Don't shy away from what you are able to do.
Yeah, I don't think there's really much you can do. I wouldn't get too discouraged by it. You're at a good school, just do the best you can do and ignore the bullies.
The good news is that also the evidence is very strong that it doesn't matter really where you go if you go to a decent place. And decent is pretty
As in,
wide
basically,
range.
There's a small number of students who are accepted at Harvard and Penn State and choose Penn State. And if you study the outcomes of them, they're not drastically different than equivalent students who chose to go to Harvard. And so probably it's not going to impact.
We don't do a great job making you better. We really don't.
It's all.
You are what you are at 17, and that's about it. And after that, we show you some things. You run around, you meet some people, but it's yeah.
We might actually make people worse.
I think there's some evidence of that starting to happen.
So basically, a university. So if you want to know what happens at a university, it's a place where you collect knowledge. So you have 18-year-olds who come in, and if any of them are smart, we take some of their knowledge, and they don't have it going out, and then we collect it.
Sponges.
Okay, maybe the last question. I'm sorry, guys, but we're out of time. Okay, we'll go to you.
Hi, my name's Shivam. I go to UT Austin. I kind of had a two-pronged question. First, you guys mentioned this time frame where this discrimination seesaw kind of balanced. I think you cited roughly 15 to 20 years. I was wondering if there was any evidence of better research published during that time, any sort of empiric of there's been better outcomes during that period. And then secondly, I kind of felt that you guys have moved towards objective metrics is better in terms of SAT, et cetera, but there's also a very big difference between the admissions rate and how many spots are there and how many people can get perfect scores or 99th percentile SATs. So after that limit is reached, how do you basically, I guess, keep the rate at which it's at, or what do you propose to do? Because that's just a mathematical problem.
So the first one, I don't think there's evidence that I've seen. That's a great question, and I hope that I'm actually going to email somebody that's doing research on that to ask that question, because they might have the answer to it. So one could measure very easily whether there's a differential level of citations, for example, right, after the fact for work done in the 90s versus now you have to adjust for the time because it takes a while for work to get cited and so on. That's a great question and something to investigate. The second question, I would say randomize. If there's too many people, and again, I hope that places, it's not just the SAT, right? One can develop objective measures, better objective measures to measure things. And if there's too many people with a certain thing, a certain level of achievement, randomize or admit more. I mean, if the whole notion of belonging, right? The Dorian mentioned, so we have these institutions that want to be exclusively inclusive. What the hell? No. If you think your product make the world better, give it to more people. Harvard sits on $40 billion in endowment. Give it to more people, but they don't. So I don't believe they believe is that good.
So
you know,
what I would say to your first question is the dynamic range of the SA2 is too narrow. So it only goes up to 3 standard deviations. And it's trivial to get an 800 on it if you're good at math. And so they could just make it harder.
not trivial. Dorian is, okay, not trivial. You got to be pretty smart, but sure, go ahead.
And so, for example, they could just make a test that's a little bit harder and also that asks about things beyond like geometry and simple logic. And then you would be able to sample out to 5 or 6 standard deviations and then you would be fine. And then the other thing that I would say about your other question, wait, can you repeat the other question? What was the other question?
Was that whether the research on
any
evidence that the research done in the 90s is any better?
The qualitative thing that I've noticed is that there's a whole lot of crappy crap that's just like, feminist perspective on geological research in anti-colonial context.
Where's Peter? Peter showed that, right? Empirically he showed that, yeah.
And so I think I think you would be able to detect this quantitatively if you looked into it, but you couldn't do it with simply something like citations because feminist anti-colonial perspective on
you
X now gets
could
cited
condition
a lot.
on decent fields, right? Economics.
No, but here's the problem: it's
creeping
now
up there
you
too.
get
It's creeping
feminist anti-colonial perspectives on hard science,
right.
as
That's true.
published in real journals.
All right, on that note, let's thank our panelists. Thank you.